There is a belief buried deep in the way we think about land, and it is quietly, dangerously wrong. The belief is that land is patient, that soil simply waits, that a farm which loses its water is like a machine that has been switched off, sitting idle, ready to roar back to life the moment the water returns. Add water, the thinking goes, and the land wakes up exactly as it was. That is the assumption underneath every comforting story about a drought ending and a valley coming back to life. But land is not a machine that waits. Land is alive, and it is changing every single day, and when you take away its water, it does not pause. It transforms. It begins a series of deep, physical, chemical, and biological changes, one triggering the next. And the further down that road it goes, the less it resembles the ground that used to grow food. And here is the part almost no one understands. Many of those changes are not reversible. They do not undo themselves when the water comes back. They lock. They become the new permanent state of the land. So a farm that loses its water source for long enough does not become a resting farm waiting to be revived. It becomes a fundamentally different kind of place, and no amount of water, later, can turn it back into what it was. This is the thing that makes the loss of a farm's water so much more serious than a bad season. It is not a subtraction that can be added back. It is the beginning of a transformation that, past a certain point, cannot be reversed by anyone, at any cost, in any time frame that matters to a human being. The water leaving is not the disaster. The water leaving is the trigger. What follows, in the ground itself, is the disaster, and it is written in a language of collapsed clay and blown topsoil and rising salt and dead soil that does not translate back into farmland no matter how much you water it. So let me show you exactly what changes, and why each change is a door that only opens one way. Because once you understand what actually happens to the land, you understand why the phrase "cannot be undone" is not drama, it is soil science. It helps first to be clear about the difference between what can come back and what cannot, because the two get dangerously blurred. Some things about a dry farm really are reversible. A single missed planting season, on land that is still healthy underneath, recovers fine when the rain returns. A reservoir that drops can refill. Even a soil that has gone a little tired can be rebuilt with care over some years. If that were the whole story, the comforting belief would be right, and land really would just wait. But those reversible losses are the shallow ones, the ones that happen before the deeper machinery of the land has been damaged. The irreversible changes are different in kind, not just in degree. They are the ones where a physical structure is destroyed, like the crushed aquifer, or where something that took an immense span of time to build is lost, like the topsoil or the living soil community, or where the system reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity, like the ecological flip into ruin. The tragedy is that a farm passes through the reversible losses first, while everyone assumes the whole thing is reversible, and by the time the irreversible changes have set in, the window to act closed long ago, quietly, without any announcement. The land looked like it was just waiting, right up until the moment it became clear it had been changing all along. Knowing which losses are which is the difference between patience and delusion. Let me begin with a scene that shows the whole tragedy in miniature. Years after a farm has gone dry and been abandoned, someone comes back to try. Maybe it is the grandchild of the family that once worked it. Someone who inherited the land and a little money and a lot of hope, and who heard that the rains have been better lately, that the region is recovering. They arrive with a plan to bring the old farm back to life, and they walk out onto the ground their family farmed for generations, and they kneel down and they take a handful of the soil, and something is wrong. It does not crumble the way soil should. It is either hard as pavement, cracked into plates, or it is loose gray dust with no life in it, or it is streaked with a white crust that stings the tongue. They dig, and there are no worms, no roots, no smell of living earth, just a dead, compacted, lifeless substrate. They bring in water at great expense and pour it on, and instead of soaking in, it runs off the hardened surface or sits in a scummy pool going nowhere. They plant, and almost nothing comes up, and what does come up is sickly and stunted. They try the things you are supposed to try. They rip up the crusted surface with machinery, and it just recrusts. They buy in loads of amendments and work them into the dirt, and the salt and the dead subsoil swallow the effort. They drill, hoping to reach water, and find the aquifer far lower than the family stories said, and what comes up is brackish. They talk to the old-timers who are still around, and see in their faces that the old-timers already know what the young returner is only now discovering, that this ground is not sleeping, it is finished, and everyone who understood the land quietly accepted that years ago. And slowly, standing in the field their family believed would always be there for them, they come to understand the thing that no one told them. The water came back. The farm did not. Because the land is not the same land anymore. It changed while it was dry, and it changed for good. That person is standing on the answer to why this matters, and to understand it, you have to go through the changes one by one, in the order the land actually experiences them. The first change happens where you cannot see it, deep underground, and it is the most literally irreversible of all. The aquifer collapses. When a farm draws its water from the ground, that water sits in the spaces between grains of sand and gravel and clay far below the surface, and in the fine clay layers especially, the water does more than fill space. It holds the structure up, its pressure propping the tiny particles apart and bearing part of the weight of all the earth above. Pump that water out and fail to replace it, and the support vanishes. The clay layers compact, collapsing down onto themselves, the poor spaces that held water crushed flat under the enormous weight of the ground above them. And this compaction is permanent. The particles pack together and lock, and they do not spring back apart when water returns. The space that once held water is simply gone, squeezed out of existence forever. This is why hydrologists talk about aquifers being permanently damaged. It is not a metaphor. The underground reservoir has physically lost a portion of its capacity to ever store water again, because the container was crushed while it was empty. So even in the impossible case that all the water came back, there would be less room to put it, permanently. And on the surface, this collapse shows itself as subsidence. The land sinking, sometimes by inches a year, sometimes by tens of feet over decades. And where it sinks unevenly, the ground tears open into long fissures. The very first change, then, before the surface even looks different, is that the underground vault which made the farm possible has partly caved in, and no force available to us can uncrush it. The foundation is gone before the walls even start to crack. The second change is the one people can actually watch happen, and it strips away the single most valuable thing the farm had. The topsoil leaves. Topsoil is not just dirt. It is the thin, dark, living upper layer, rich with organic matter and structure, that actually makes land able to grow things, and it took an extraordinarily long time to form, in many places hundreds to thousands of years, to build a single few inches of it. Grain by grain, season by season, from decayed plants and weathered rock and the slow work of countless living things. And what held that precious layer in place was the crop and the moisture, the roots gripping it, the canopy shielding it from the wind, the dampness binding the particles together. Take away the water, and the crop dies. And the ground goes bare and dry, and the protection is gone. Then the wind comes, and it does not take the soil evenly. It lifts the finest, lightest, most fertile particles first, the very best of the soil, the part richest in nutrients and organic matter, and carries them away in clouds, leaving behind a coarser, poorer, more lifeless ground. On a windy day, a dead field visibly smokes, its own topsoil rising off it and blowing across the landscape, and this is precisely the mechanism that created the Dust Bowl. When exposed, drought-stricken farmland lifted into black blizzards and blew away, taking with it the fertility of a region. Here is why it cannot be undone. That topsoil took centuries to build, and it will take centuries to rebuild, if it ever rebuilds at all, and only under the right conditions of moisture and vegetation that a dry, dead field does not have. You cannot manufacture centuries of soil formation in a human lifetime. When the topsoil blows away, the land loses the very layer that defined it as farmland, and there is no practical way to put it back. The wind writes that loss into the sky, and it does not return the deposit. The third change is chemical, and it turns the ground itself hostile to life. The soil fills with salt. All water, even fresh irrigation water, carries dissolved salts, and every time that water is applied to a field and then evaporates or is taken up by the crop, it leaves those salts behind in the soil. On a working, well-managed farm, growers fight this constantly, flushing the soil with extra water to wash the accumulated salt down and away below the root zone. It is a fight that never ends, and it only works as long as there is plenty of water to do the flushing. When the water source is lost, that fight is abandoned, and worse, as the wells get desperate, they often pump saltier, deeper water in the final years, loading the soil with even more. Then, with no more flushing and the surface baking under the sun, the process reverses. Moisture in the soil evaporates upward, and as it rises and evaporates, it draws the dissolved salts up with it, depositing them at and near the surface until a pale, crusted layer of salt spreads across the ground. Salt-poisoned soil is chemically hostile to most plants. It interferes with their ability to take up water at all, so that even in moist soil a plant can wilt as if in a drought. And high enough concentrations are simply lethal to most crops. This is one of the oldest forms of land death known to civilization. Ancient societies destroyed their own farmland this way thousands of years ago, and some of that salted ground has never fully recovered even now. Removing salt from soil is enormously difficult and expensive, requiring vast amounts of clean water. The exact thing the land no longer has, plus drainage systems and years of effort, and often it simply is not economically possible. So the salt stays. The very act of having been irrigated, followed by the loss of the water, leaves the ground chemically ruined in a way that can outlast everything else, a poisoning that the land inflicts on itself as it dries. The fourth change is biological, and it is the one people almost never think about, because it happens at a scale too small to see. The soil dies. Healthy farmland is not an inert mineral medium. It is one of the most densely alive environments on the planet, a teeming ecosystem where a single handful of good soil contains billions of bacteria, miles of fungal threads, and countless other organisms, all working together in ways that make the soil fertile. There are the mycorrhizal fungi that weave through the roots of plants and extend their reach for water and nutrients, a partnership hundreds of millions of years old. There are the bacteria that fix nitrogen and cycle nutrients. There are the earthworms and insects and microscopic creatures that build soil structure and break down organic matter into the food that plants live on. This living community is what actually makes soil productive, far more than the dead minerals alone. And it depends utterly on moisture and on living plants feeding it through their roots. Take away the water and kill the crops, and this underground civilization begins to die. The moisture-loving organisms perish. The fungal networks, deprived of the living roots they partnered with, break down. The organic matter that fed everything oxidizes away in the bare, baking soil or blows off with the topsoil. Within a few dry, dead years, the rich living soil becomes something closer to a sterile mineral dust, and here is why this cannot simply be switched back on. You cannot reseed a dead soil ecosystem the way you plant a crop. That community took a very long time to assemble, in balance, and rebuilding it requires organic matter, moisture, living plants, and time, often a great deal of time, under conditions the ruined land no longer provides. Even if you flooded the dead field with water, you would be watering a corpse. The biological engine that turned dirt into fertile soil has stopped, and restarting it is the work of decades or longer, not the work of a wet season. The fifth change is structural, and it is a cruel one, because it means that even if the water does return, the land can no longer accept it. The soil hardens and seals. Living soil has structure, a crumbly, porous architecture built by roots and fungi and organic matter, full of tiny channels and spaces that let water soak in, air move through, and roots push down. That structure is one of the great gifts of healthy soil, and it too depends on the biology and the moisture and the plants. When those are lost, the structure collapses, the soil compacts and slumps. The organic glue that held the crumbs together is gone. On the bare surface, the sun and the occasional hard rain form a hard, sealed crust, and below it the soil can set into a dense hardpan. And now, something terrible has happened to the land's relationship with water itself. A dead, crusted, compacted soil cannot absorb water the way living soil could. When rain finally falls on it, instead of soaking in and being stored, the water runs off the hardened surface, taking more soil with it, or it pools on top and evaporates, having done nothing. This is the final insult, the one that makes recovery almost impossible even in principle. The land has been changed so that it can no longer drink. You could bring the rains back in full, and much of that water would simply slide off the sealed ground and away, because the soil has lost the structure that let it capture and hold moisture in the first place. The very thing you would need to revive the land, water, is now largely rejected by the land itself. A farm in this state is not thirsty ground waiting for a drink. It is ground that has forgotten how to drink, and teaching it again means rebuilding the soil structure from nothing, which means rebuilding the biology and the organic matter, which means the work of generations. The sixth change is ecological, and it is the one that locks all the others into place. The whole living system flips into a new state, and it fights to stay there. Ecosystems do not always slide smoothly back and forth. Often they exist in a particular stable state, held there by a web of self-reinforcing conditions, and they can be pushed, past a certain point, into a completely different stable state, which then defends itself just as stubbornly as the first one did. Scientists call this hysteresis, or alternative stable states, and it is one of the most important and least understood ideas in all of ecology. Here is what it means for a dead farm. The productive farmland was one stable state, held together by moisture, living soil, and the crops themselves. Push it too far by removing the water, and it flips into a new stable state, a degraded, dry, salt-crusted, hardpan scrubland dominated by tough invasive weeds like tumbleweed. And that new state is not a way station on the road back to farmland. It is a destination, and it actively resists returning. The invasive plants that colonize the ruined ground are adapted to exactly those harsh conditions, and they hold the territory, crowding out anything else, and often making the soil even more prone to fire and further degradation. The crusted soil sheds the water that might have helped recovery. The lost biology cannot reestablish because the plants that would feed it are not there, and the plants cannot establish because the biology and the structure and the moisture are not there. Every broken piece holds every other broken piece in place. The system has settled into a new equilibrium, a stable state of ruin, and to drag it back across the line to farmland, you would have to fix everything at once, all the changes together, against a system actively pulling the other way. That is what makes the point of no return a real line and not a gradual slope. On one side, the land tends back toward fertility. On the other side, it tends toward ruin and defends it. This is the single most important thing to understand about why recovery is so nearly impossible, and it is the least intuitive, because we naturally imagine that if you remove the cause of damage, the damage simply reverses. With a flipped ecosystem, it does not. The dry, salt-crusted, weed-held state is not a broken version of farmland straining to return to health the moment it gets a chance. It is a stable, self-maintaining system in its own right, as robust in its ruin as the farm was in its fertility, and it will sit there, holding its ground, for as long as nature allows, actively resisting every push back toward what it was. Undoing it is not a matter of stopping the harm. The harm stopped long ago. It is a matter of overpowering a functioning system that has every reason to stay exactly as it is, and that is a vastly harder thing than simply letting the land rest. The seventh change reaches beyond the field, into the water and the air of the whole surrounding area, and it too does not simply reverse. The local hydrology and climate of the land itself shift. A farm was not an isolated square of ground, it was part of a local water and weather system, and when it dies, that system changes around it. The wetlands, ponds, and damp low spots that the farm's irrigation and the high water table once supported dry up, and the wildlife and vegetation that depended on them vanish. The natural drainage of the area changes as the ground compacts and subsides, and the vegetation disappears, so that when rain does come, it moves across the landscape differently, running off where it used to soak in, cutting new gullies, pooling in new places. The bare, dry ground even affects the local microclimate, radiating heat, adding dust to the air, drying the winds that pass over it, so that a large enough area of dead land can make its own surroundings hotter and drier, nudging the whole local environment further from the conditions that farming needs. In this way, the ruined land does not just sit there passively. It reshapes the flows of water and heat around it into a new pattern, one that tends to reinforce the dryness rather than heal it, extending its own hostile conditions outward into whatever is nearby. The change is not contained within the fence line, and it does not politely wait to be reversed. It spreads its new, drier logic across the whole surrounding landscape. And there is an eighth change above the ground rather than in it that is every bit as hard to undo as the others, because it removes the one thing that could ever fight back against all of them. The human system that knew how to work the land dissolves. Farming a specific piece of ground is not generic knowledge. It is a deep, particular understanding of which corner floods and which bakes, of how this soil behaves in a wet year and a dry one, built over a lifetime and handed down over generations. When the water goes and the farm dies, the family that held that knowledge scatters, the old farmers retire or pass on, and the children, in enormous numbers, choose other lives far away. That knowledge does not exist in a book. It lives in people, and when they go, it goes with them, and it cannot be advertised for or bought back. Around the farm, the whole supporting world dissolves too. The equipment, the processors, the neighbors, the entire human infrastructure that made farming possible, and it does not reassemble on command. So even in the fantasy where the soil could be healed, there would be no one left who knew how to farm that exact ground, and nothing left of the system that supported them. The land loses not only its physical ability to grow food, but the human capacity to make it do so. Both halves, the living soil and the living knowledge, drain away together, and both take generations to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. A ruined farm is not just abandoned dirt, it is abandoned understanding, and that absence is its own locked door. Now step back and look at all of these changes together, because the horror of it is not any single one, it is the way they combine. The aquifer collapses and cannot be refilled. The topsoil blows away and cannot be rebuilt in any useful time frame. The salt rises and poisons the ground. The living soil dies and cannot be simply replanted. The structure hardens so the land can no longer absorb water. The whole ecosystem flips into a stable state of ruin that fights to stay ruined. The local water and weather shift to reinforce the dryness. And every one of these changes makes every other one harder to reverse. You cannot fix the biology without moisture and organic matter. You cannot restore the organic matter without the topsoil that blew away. You cannot get water into the ground because the crust sheds it. You cannot leach the salt without vast amounts of clean water that no longer exists. You cannot refill the aquifer that has already been crushed. To bring the farm back, you would have to reverse all of these at the same time, each against the resistance of all the others, and that is why, past a certain point, it simply cannot be done. Not because we lack the will, though we often do, but because the physics and chemistry and biology of the ruined land have arranged themselves into a locked configuration that no practical intervention can unlock. The changes are not a list of separate problems. They are a single, interlocking trap. To really feel why cannot be undone is the honest phrase. It helps to put actual time spans on these changes, because the human mind hears permanent and quietly translates it into a very long time, as if a few decades of patience might do it. It will not. Consider the numbers. Fertile topsoil forms at a rate so slow it is almost hard to believe, on the order of centuries, to build a single inch of it under natural conditions, which means the few inches that blow off a dead field in a handful of dry years represent many hundreds, even thousands of years of accumulated soil building. Gone, the ancient groundwater in the deepest aquifers took tens of thousands of years, in some places far longer, to collect, and recharges so slowly that refilling what has been pumped would take a span of time that dwarfs all of recorded history. The living soil community, in the best case, might rebuild in a matter of decades under ideal conditions of moisture and vegetation, but only if everything else is already in place to support it, which on ruined land it is not. Salt, once concentrated in soil, can persist for centuries without the water to flush it. Put these together, and the time scale of true recovery, if it happens at all, is measured not in seasons or years, but in centuries and millennia. In spans that make the word permanent, for any purpose that concerns living people and their children and their grandchildren, simply accurate. When we say the land cannot be undone, we are not being poetic. We are saying that the clock required to reverse it runs longer than civilizations last. And if you doubt that land can be ruined permanently, history has already run the experiment more than once at the scale of whole civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, the very cradle of farming, some of the earliest societies on Earth irrigated their fields for centuries, and the same salt accumulation we have been describing slowly poisoned their soil, forcing them to switch from wheat to more salt-tolerant barley, and eventually driving once mighty agricultural cities into decline on ground that had been made barren by their own irrigation. Some of that land, thousands of years later, has still not fully recovered. The Fertile Crescent, the place that taught humanity to farm, contains stretches that farming itself rendered infertile, and the passage of millennia did not undo it. Look at the exposed bed of the Aral Sea in Central Asia, drained within living memory when its rivers were diverted for cotton. Now a salt and chemical-crusted desert where a great sea used to be, its former shores a graveyard of rusting ships, its dust poisoning the region. Look at the parts of the American plains that were stripped in the Dust Bowl and remain marginal and fragile generations later. Look at valleys drained of their water a century ago that never came back to life. These are not hypotheticals or projections. They are real places, on the real map, where the loss of water and the ruin of soil proved permanent across spans of time so long that entire civilizations rose and fell while the land stayed dead. History does not offer us a single reassuring example of a truly ruined agricultural landscape snapping back. It offers us the opposite. A long, sobering record of land that humans destroyed and could never bring back, no matter how much time they were given. And this is why the person who came back to revive the family farm failed, no matter how much hope and money they brought. They imagined they were restarting a machine that had been switched off. What they were actually facing was a piece of ground that had become a different thing entirely while it was dry, its aquifer crushed, its topsoil gone, its chemistry poisoned, its life extinguished, its structure sealed, its ecology settled into ruin, its very drainage and climate turned against recovery. Water alone could not touch that. Because water alone was never what was lost. What was lost was an entire integrated living system, and systems like that do not reassemble because you add back the one ingredient that first went missing. You can pour water on ruined land forever, and it will remain ruined land that happens to be wet, because the thing that made it farmland was never just the water. It was everything the water made possible, and all of that unraveled permanently in the water's absence. And someone will always ask, but could we not simply fix it with enough money and enough technology? Consider honestly what fixing even a single ruined acre would actually require, and the scale of the answer tells you why it is not going to happen. You would need to rebuild the topsoil that blew away, which in nature takes centuries. And to do it artificially at scale, you would need vast quantities of organic material and compost trucked in and worked into the ground year after year. You would need to leach out the salt, which requires enormous volumes of clean water and functioning drainage, the very water the land no longer has. You would need to break up the hardpan and rebuild the soil structure. Then, reintroduce the living community of microbes and fungi and worms, and nurse it back over years with cover crops and moisture. And you would need to do all of it at once, because each piece depends on the others. And you would need to keep the water flowing the entire time, on land that lost its water in the first place. For a single acre, this is a heroic and expensive undertaking. Now multiply it by the hundreds of thousands, the millions of acres crossing this threshold across the country. The cost and the water required run into numbers that have no relationship to what the land could ever produce in return. It is not that restoring ruined farmland is scientifically impossible in a laboratory sense. It is that doing it at any meaningful scale, on the ground, in the real world, with real water and real money, is so far beyond what is feasible that it amounts to the same thing. We cannot buy our way out of this, because the bill is written in centuries of soil formation and oceans of water we do not have. So consider what this really means for the country, because these are not rare, isolated failures. Across the farming regions running on borrowed water, this transformation is underway right now, at every stage, on real ground. Some land is early in the sequence, the crop just dead, still looking almost recoverable. Some is well along, the topsoil gone and the salt rising. And some has completed the journey and crossed fully into the stable state of ruin, permanently subtracted from the country's ability to grow food. And because the early stages look so survivable, so much like an ordinary bad patch, the permanence is almost never recognized until it is far too late, until the land is quietly past the point where any of it can be pulled back. We keep treating this as a series of temporary hardships, droughts to be waited out, when in truth we are watching an accumulating, irreversible loss of the actual physical basis of our food production. Acre by acre, region by region, each loss disguised as a rough season. The nation's farmland is not a fixed asset that dips and recovers with the weather. Where the water is being lost, it is being permanently transformed into something that cannot feed anyone. And that transformation does not reverse when the headlines say the drought has broken. And unlike almost every other kind of loss a country can suffer, this one has no do-over. A factory that closes can be rebuilt. A forest that burns can, given time, regrow. But farmland whose soil has been physically and chemically and biologically destroyed is not rebuildable on any schedule that helps us, which makes it one of the few truly one-way losses a nation can inflict on itself. We are, quietly and without deciding to, spending down a portion of the irreplaceable foundation that feeds us and calling the spending a series of bad years. And the reason we keep sleepwalking into this, region after region, is that every wet year whispers the opposite of the truth. When the rains finally come and the reservoirs rise and the surviving fields green up, it looks like proof that the land is resilient, that it bounces back, that the fears were overblown. But that visible, surface-level recovery is happening on the land that had not yet crossed the line, and it says nothing at all about the ground that had. A good rain year cannot uncrush an aquifer, cannot rebuild 1,000 years of lost topsoil, cannot leach out the salt or resurrect the dead soil biology or teach sealed ground to drink again. It just paints a hopeful green over the parts that were still alive, while the truly ruined land sits in the same wet season absorbing almost none of it, unchanged, so the public sees the green, concludes the danger has passed, and turns away. And the slow permanent losses continue underneath, unwatched, because the one signal everyone reads, the visible surface in a wet year, is precisely the signal that hides the irreversible damage. We are reassured by exactly the thing that should not reassure us, and so the transformation proceeds, region by region, under cover of the occasional good year, until the ruin is too widespread and too advanced to keep ignoring. The grandchild stood in the dead field with the failed crop and the runoff pooling on the hard ground, and finally understood that the stories of the land simply waiting, patient, for the water to return, were a comfort and not a truth. The aquifer beneath them had collapsed and would never again hold what it once did. The topsoil that took 1,000 years to build had blown away in a few. The salt had risen and stayed. The living soil had died down to sterile dust. The ground had sealed itself against the very rain that might have saved it, and the whole ruined system had settled into a new and stubborn balance that pulled always toward death and never toward life. Water had come back to the region, a little, in the wet years. It had changed nothing here, because the land was no longer the land their family had known. It had become, quietly and completely and permanently, something else. That is what happens once a farm loses its water source. Not a pause, not a wound that heals. A transformation, written into the physics of the soil and the chemistry of the ground and the death of 1 billion invisible living things, into a new kind of place that no water, ever, can turn back into a farm. The land does not wait. It changes. And some of those changes, once made, are made forever. The water was only ever the key that held the door open. Once it is gone long enough, the door does not just close. It seals, and the ground on the other side of it becomes a place that will never grow food again, no matter who comes back, no matter what they bring, no matter how long they are willing to wait.